Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Colin Wallace toku ingoa, Executive Director of Digital Identity New Zealand, DINZ for short. We're New Zealand's only digital identity industry association dedicated to this topic. It's my pleasure to welcome you and welcome our panelists to this Privacy Week session, Privacy and Online Identity, Exploring Algorithmic and Digital Identity. As we were just saying in the lead up, these things have a crossover, but they're not entirely overlapping, not entirely at all. So it's my pleasure now to introduce you to the panel. And our first panelist, we actually are missing one. We hope that our fourth panelist will overcome the technical difficulties she's got and join us. Karen Nan is calling us from Auckland. She's a partner at prestigious law firm Simpson Grierson, where she leads the technology, data protection and privacy teams there at Simpson Grierson. We have David Ding. He's also from Auckland, and he's the innovation strategist and advisor at DINZ member Callaghan Innovation. And thirdly, on the screen here, we have Tom Norcliffe, privacy and information professional from software company Middleware Group. So hailing in from Christchurch, all parts of the country and the world, as we are very much at DINZ. We do have one missing panelist for those of you who have checked on this, checked up this session before joining us. Sarah Alvua from Wellington. She's the lead digital trust partner at Spark New Zealand, and we're very much hoping that she'll be on the call very soon. And that her now. Are you on the line yet, Sarah? Not yet, it seems. Okay.
Sorry, it was Sarah here.
Oh,
I've just joined by phone, but I'm hoping to join from my laptop shortly.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. So you've seen the bios of the panelists in the lead up to this session. What we're going to do here is we're going to work through this topic, but you're more than welcome, audience, to pop your questions into the Q&A, and we'll address them as and when we can along the way. So please don't be shy. Anything that you have on your mind, please pop it into the Q&A. That's the most efficient way to do this. I want to start with just, laying a little bit of context here as we sort of introduce the panel. They'll self-introduce themselves. And really, what is digital identity? And we talk about digital identity, a lot, but there's really, the first thing to appreciate is that identity is in many cases a shorthand, if you like, for the term identification. And identification is something that's happened, through the ages. Often with the village and so on. Who are you? The head of the village can often vouch for you as being, yes, he or she is who they say they are, and part of the village and so on. So that's actually translated, if you like, into modern times with digital identity and identification. And that question of seeking evidence that you are who you say you are, or claim to be, is pretty important. Of course, digital identity and identification isn't just restricted to people. It's also equally as applicable to devices and software. All of these things have an identity as well. And increasingly, as our transactions go online, it's incredibly important that that these are bound together. Your personal digital identification is bound to your credentials through an authentication process. So digital identification covers that initial orchestration of determining who you claim to be. the evidence of identity, and then moving on to authentication and confirming who you are as you return back to a transaction to log in again, as it were, before you receive services through authorization is the process typically called there. I want to ask each of our panelists if they have anything more to add there. I'll start with Karen. Anything more to add, Karen, from what I've said?
Thanks, Colin. I guess the only thing that I would add is that digital identity deals with not only being able to identify who a person or a device is in terms of, for example, a person's name, a person's email address, or their date of birth, etc. But it's also covers digital activities. So transactions that might be carried out online, any interaction or engagement that you have with others. So I guess, anything that relates to a person, an organisation, or an entity that's conducted online.
Great, thank you. David, anything from you? And just saying, Sarah, if it looks like you're coming fully online, you'll be next. David, anything?
I think from my perspective, I would say that digital identity is slightly different from digital identification, in that your identity could be a persona, whereby if you can prove if you can identify yourself, you could potentially have an infinite array of personas. So,
of course,
I work in the Web3 space, so I think we're seeing this kind of trend emerging at the moment.
Good point to add. Thank you so much. Sarah, welcome. On mute, Sarah.
Sorry, I'm just settling in. I was just listening while our IT person was helping me out, so I might join in on the next question. Thank you.
All right then. Okay, Tom.
Look, thanks, Colin. And just to pick on your point and David's, I guess, is that I guess I come at things probably more broadly, just to sort of contextualize things to the audience. I'm actually an archivist by profession and training, so I sort of feel a little bit fortunate on the tech space. But I sort of consider as you mentioned, the identity of somebody being the head of a village goes to what they are and how they represent themselves. And I think that the same works in the digital space. We present ourselves and have multiple personas online, and each of those are wrapped up in our own identity somehow in some form. Oftentimes it's simply just your basic credentials that maybe an online retail outfit might have asked you, or it might be everything that you produce and share with the world on Facebook. So it's that multiplicity of both personas and the facets of your digital self. And they have a range of, I guess, purposes, or they provide an interface between the real world and the digital world to enable us to get access to services, or to buy products, or to engage in other ways effectively online as the people that we claim to be. Right. So that would be my take. It's that whole of holistic view of you and yourself online.
Good point. Good point there. Thank you for that. Sarah, returning to you, how are we on the technicals now?
Good for now, fingers crossed.
Do you have anything to add to what's already been talked about in the description in a general sense of digital identity?
No, I'd really just emphasise the importance and the opportunities that it presents.
Absolutely, and that's a perfect segue, if you like. Since you're holding the microphone, perhaps you could start us off with what do you see as the benefits of digital identity, and to the extent that algorithms play into aspects of it.
Well, okay, I think, unfortunately, if I start with a slightly negative perspective, which is that we're increasingly seeing fraudsters impersonating customers of all organisations.
Yes. And
we're increasingly seeing cyber attackers looking for stores of information that they might be able to use to, again, impersonate individuals en masse. And so it's a really tricky balancing act for organisations of all types these days to be able to protect their customers at an individual level and make sure that they're not having bad debts incurred in their name for services they haven't purchased. Then the practical difficulties of actually having to sort of collate and hold for even temporarily some identification documentation. And so that's a tightrope that all organisations are following, and certainly having seen, all of us have seen what happened to Optus. So I think that digital identity provides a wealth of opportunities in that space to minimise the risks while protecting people from fraudsters.
Yes.
On a more positive note, as a sort of privacy officer under the Privacy Act, I think there's some genuine excitement for all of us in terms of the way in which digital identity can be managed to really align with the privacy principles. So in terms of minimising the collection of information, but also ensuring that information isn't collected in a way that's intrusive. Right. And I think, interestingly, there may come a day when collection of information for identity purposes via the paper-based method may actually turn out to be regarded as overly intrusive, when there's going to be so many opportunities for digital identity available. And then secondly, just the minimisation of information means that it's so much more difficult as a result to run afoul of Privacy Act principles relating to use and storage and security and so on. So I think it really works well for everybody concerned, provided it's implemented well.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for that. And I know that Karen has some particular views that we'll explore later on how we can better align what's sort of kind of missing in our toolbox that would help things along there. Right. Okay. Can I ask David, got his mic on next, for your thoughts, David, on what you see as the benefits?
Well, you know, I see a lot of stuff going on in the innovation space on this topic, the most gnarly one being zero knowledge proofs, being that if you can prove that you are that you possess knowledge, then that negates you having to actually reveal it. And so that's an interesting concept when you talk about identity, because you can then have a trustless transaction that is totally trusted, but you can be totally anonymous at the same time. So it's almost paradoxical in that you've provided evidence of your identification, however, you have no persona. So in terms of you know, algorithms, I'd say, of course, they're essential. But I'd say there's a lot of innovation going on in this space algorithmically to imbue more and more trust into systems. And I think what we're seeing is there's so much trust in technology now, in certain technologies, that intermediary, typically transactions managed by intermediaries such as banks. You know, we're seeing massive transactions taking place on asset exchanges without banks acting as an intermediary. So we're obviously making really great progress in this area, and it's only going to get better.
That's great. Yes, indeed. You know, if you think that the whole digital economy and the growth of it is really predicated on digital identification and the ability to be able to transact online. So ways to efficiently and in a very privacy-centric way of doing that is critical. Tom, can we have your thoughts on the benefits?
Yeah, look, thank you. Again, just to pick up on, I guess, what both Sarah and David said, I think, and I couldn't put a time frame on this, but I think over probably the last decade or so, the technology's got to the point where we can break ourselves out of a paper-bound worldview. So when I first started, after I left archives, went into another public sector and was sort of working in the privacy space. A lot of the processes, for instance, were still paper-bound. It's just we did them digitally. So, you know, in order to assess somebody's legitimacy, a paper ID document of some description had to be cited, and then there was a trust issue because it was scanned and stored in the ether somewhere, probably poorly managed. because it was the paper thing, the paper document that provided the authenticity that the person stepping up at the counter was the person who claimed they were the person that they claimed to be.
Yeah.
And as David said, I think the benefit as we move forward is that that trust level can be sort of, as he said, paradoxically anonymized. So you can claim to be who you are with the assurance that there's sufficient data behind that, sufficient assurance behind that, that when you show up at the counter in a virtual space, the person behind the counter or the machine behind the counter actually knows and can be assured that the claim coming in from you is actually from you. So I think that transition to and the ability to enhance trust and remove the unnecessary accumulation of uncontrolled identity documents that float around networks all the time are two of the biggest benefits. And of course, the reason we're doing this is to promote a digital economy, and without being able to prove who we are in that environment, it's all just going to fall to pieces. So the technology goes hand in hand with that move into a digital commercial and cultural world, I guess.
Yes, great points, Tom. Great points. Karen, benefits as you see them?
Well, really, just building on what everybody else has already said, I guess the key themes would be just convenience and efficiency. Obviously, if you're able to prove yourself or establish your digital identity, once it's set up, then conceivably you only have to do it once. You don't have to keep looking for those paper-based documents. And as Tom mentioned, you have greater, I guess that the organisation relying on the digital identity can have some greater assurance as to the validity of that means of identification. And arguably, once you've set up your digital identity, you've got better access to your own information as well. So I guess really just the convenience and efficiency.
Right. Well, since you have the speaking stick, Karen, can we pivot across to what do you see as the potential challenges?
Yeah, I guess there are, we've talked about some really, great benefits that we can get through the use of digital identity, but I guess one of the key challenges that I see is the issue of trust, because if we don't have systems that are good at protecting digital identity and the information that we make available online, then there is not going to be a great uptake by people who we want to use these services. And the OPC, Office of the Privacy Commissioner, runs a survey every couple of years to, I guess, take a bit of an assessment of what people are concerned about in terms of privacy. And then, of course, DINZ, we do our survey as well.
Absolutely, yes.
And,
yes,
and I was just looking at some of those numbers that came out of those surveys. They're not surprisingly quite comparable. But some of the key highlights from those surveys were that we've got around about the OPC surveys show 63% of people were concerned about businesses sharing personal information without permission. The DINZ survey result was a bit higher at 78%. But there's also concern about security of personal information on the internet, sitting around 60%, and more than 50% of the respondents to the OPC survey indicated that they were concerned about government agencies sharing information without permission. And then also some concerns around the use of facial recognition technology in public places. So lots of concern around trust, and I think a lot of work still needs to be done around that. And I guess critically for organisations is that both surveys indicated that New Zealanders would or have adapted their online behaviour because of their concerns around privacy.
That's right. Thank you so much for that. And your just to help the audience along here, your references to the DINZ research is contained in a report, people, the State of Digital Identity in Aotearoa, and you can find that on the Digital Identity, DINZ's website, digitalidentity.nz. In the middle menu, you'll see our work, and you scroll down there and you'll see the report that we published in February with results survey that was done the previous July. So thank you so much for that. Sarah, you had much of your benefits turned into challenges, as I recall. Is there anything you would like to add in terms of the challenges there, or perhaps frame them again?
Sure. So I think for me, one of the biggest challenges is looking at New Zealand. We already have a big divide in digital equity. So we have a number of segments of society who, for various reasons, aren't using digital technology, or they're not signing up for online services. And the reasons for that are varied. It can be financial, it can be lack of confidence, it can be lack of trust. There's so many different reasons behind that. But what that means is that as we start to move towards using digital identity as a way of protecting people from fraud, potentially vulnerable groups will actually become at greater risk of financial harm. And so I think the challenge for all of us is to think about what can we do as we start to lead into these more increasingly sophisticated technology methodologies. How can we really work to build the confidence of our individual customers, and what would it take, as Karen said, to help them to trust us, to take them through those journeys?
Yes, yeah.
And I feel like a really interesting challenge is how we would obviously be all wanting to sort of encourage people to adapt digital identity technologies within our own organisations. But I think we have to be careful to do that in a way that doesn't actually penalise those people who choose not to take it up.
Indeed.
And so perhaps, for example, something which offers financial incentives could further financially penalise those people who are not adapting technology for financial reasons. So I think there'll be quite a few ethical issues for us to work through. So it's really pleasing to see the recent bill passed by Parliament focuses on people opting into these services, at least with accredited providers. And so I think for all of us, it's going to be how do we take people on the journey in a way that they're comfortable with at their own pace, so that they can get the benefits from the technology.
Indeed. Yes, thank you. David, you've got your mic open. Some additional thoughts from you on the challenges?
I think the challenge is around data sovereignty. You know, at what stage is it culture? At what stage is it language? And who truly owns it? We see a lot of business model innovation happening at the moment where there's a digital platform. It's harvesting the data from the customers, and then that's being turned into an asset and commercialized. So access to that data is then being commercialized in another way. And so, you know, there needs to be ethics around this. And I think it's still, you know, early days, but what we're seeing now is business model innovation, whereby the initial customers that are adding to that information, to that pool of data that's growing into an asset, are becoming shareholders in a holding company. And so they're receiving a share of the spoils generated from the commercial activity from that data. So I think solutions that are more collaborative between customers and founders can work quite well when it's kind of grey area at the moment, but very, very difficult to define where those boundaries are.
Thank you, indeed. Yes, it is. It's increasingly difficult. That's absolutely right. Tom, some final thoughts from you on this one, sir.
Well, I've got a list.
Right.
So, but it's interesting listening to David there, because one of the things, and the rest of the panel, to be fair, on the issue of trust, because I think fundamentally, I was possibly a little bit disparaging of paper before, but fundamentally, if you've got something physical in your hand, you can control that. And I think there's a real challenge around providing users with the proper control over their digital identity online, to give them that trust that it's actually them that is in control of it. And that flows through to the whole ecosystem, if you like. So if you think about data breaches or the concerns around sharing inappropriately or anything of that sort of second, third hand, or even just the opacity of how information about me has been controlled or used by another agency, if you can be assured that you control it and have transparency to how it's being used and what it's being used for, and can approve and withdraw approval on how it's being used, that goes a long way to building up that trust and the assurances that I can control the information that I'm using, and that transcends. So it's not just that sort of the identification data, if you like, the things that make me who I am, but it's the stuff that I've created and put online as well that you want to be given more control over. So think about some of the angst that Elon Musk has created in the Twitter world, where people are all of a sudden thinking, wow, shippers, this guy's come along and bought a privatized a company which was previously a public entity, and there's a lot of my data up there that I've shared, which maybe I'd now like to control more effectively. If you extend that out into that control model, and if you in the future, and this is, I'll be keen on maybe David's take on this, but if in the future there's the ability for you to knit all your digital identities together in a way that gives you control across and beyond the boundary of you and an agency, then I think the trust framework builds up, and people would be a lot more assured around what's happening with their data, because they know effectively what was happening.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's certainly a two-way street, and you nicely brought in the need for the service provider to confirm the identity of the person in that way, is as much as it is for the individual to confirm that it's actually talking with the right service provider. So the back channel, and of course the things we've used SMS and things like that as verification in the past, but of course those are subject to attack as well. And so of course we have Microsoft Authenticator and some of the other tools, passkeys now, and more other things that are moving there. It was, and I was going to just lining you up here, queuing you, David. You're probably next, but I do want to just see this question. I want to draw the panel to the attention of Vanya Vida's question, which I want you to read, while I just perhaps ask David, since Tom had suggested you might have a view there briefly. Do you have thoughts there before we go to Vanya's question?
Yeah, I would say the dependency on digital identity for those things to be resolved is essential. There has to be a universal trusted source of truth that is trusted by everyone involved. And I think for the topics of data sovereignty to be solved, I think, in terms of the harvesting of data, at the moment with AI, you've got people using chatbots and actually training the model. That's your behavior, that's really your data. And so, innovations we're seeing now are, you may have a child learning a language on an app, and the person that owns the data is paying you to train the model. So we are seeing things being flipped on its head in that regard. So I think the pendulum will keep swinging back and forth until we can reconcile it.
Indeed, yes, that's so true. So to questions, there seems to be a little bit of trouble with the panel seeing the question, so I'm going to read it out. Vanya says, is there consideration given to create systems that enable cross-border use of digital identity? what are the risks of creating a cross-border interoperable digital identity system, and what mitigations would need to be adopted? What mitigations would need to be adopted? I do have some thoughts on that myself, but I want to just check with the panel. Is there a panelist who wants to have a first go at it?
I think it'll be interesting from a privacy framework perspective, that at the moment countries are having difficulty outside of the European Union. Countries are having difficulty sort of aligning on privacy frameworks and legislation and agreeing that there's sort of equivalence between countries. So I feel like there'll be a lot of work on the regulatory front to enable that cross-border sharing. But I do think it's a fantastic idea, and perhaps it should be given priority as we're looking at those sorts of overseas equivalence arrangements. Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, thanks. So any other panelists with a thought on that one?
Well, I guess for me, it comes down to, I guess, a definition as to what we mean by cross-border and digital identity, because at the moment, I've got digital identity with Microsoft and with Google and with any other number of IDPs that go wherever I need them to go, and they're not bound by a particular jurisdiction. So in that regard, I think we've already got it. I guess what it then comes down to is the assurance that when I created an identity, it is actually me and not somebody else pretending to be me, or a persona that I've created for the purpose of accessing a airport free Wi-Fi service. So I think the challenge is the assurance associated with it, and how that assurance is brokered at a state level to make sure that the claim that goes fundamentally back to, say, the births, deaths, marriages, and who it is when you were born, you were the person that you were born as, continues all the way through, and can be that assurance can translate across borders. Oh, and Colin, you're on mute there, I think.
Sorry, I am too. Karen, any final thoughts there? Do want to get into the questions after this.
No, nothing to add to that.
Right. Okay. So we have a very long question from Gavin here. Well, the question is at the end. I see just for those who aren't able to see the Q&A for whatever reason. Gavin says, we've seen a rise over recent years of public concern about threats to privacy, which many people see as a fundamental human right, particularly threats of Big Brother, government surveillance and control. We saw this play out internationally in EU's rejection of Safe Harbor, Privacy Shield, and now potentially the new EU US data protection framework, where the EU is not happy with the US government's desire. I would actually thinking these things aren't merged not quite correctly, Gavin, but nonetheless, where the EU is not happy with the US government's desire that its security agencies are able to undertake general surveillance of its citizens. Early last year in Canada and here in New Zealand, we saw droves of people turn out in small towns waving flags, cheering for the freedom convoys that pass through the towns en route to Parliament to protect their government's attacks on privacy and freedom in response to COVID-19. Digital identity may increase the ability to threaten personal freedoms. How can citizens realise the benefits of digital identity that you've described, but be protected from the threat of surveillance by Big Brother government? You're using some quite emotive words there, Gavin, but I'd like to have the panel's take on it. Perhaps starting with you, Karen.
Thanks, Colin. Well, I guess it comes down to the point that I made earlier about trust, and having some assurance that there is actually some framework in which this will be managed. And you know, there has been a lot of media about the use of CCTV in public places, and use of and, you know, the police taking photographs of youths in various regions. And, you know, it's not only a New Zealand phenomenon, but, you know, also an issue offshore. So I think it really is there actually being some sort of system put in place or some understanding as to what is the right thing. And I think, you know, there will be different levels of trust depending on which agency you're dealing with and which jurisdiction, I think. But certainly in terms of surveillance, I know that with the AI regulation that is being proposed in the EU, surveillance is one of the issues that is being addressed in that that regulation. So, you know, that's still some way away, but I think it is a recognised issue.
Yeah, it's difficult to keep up, but there is a sense that there is. I would add the point that, of course, it's not all government surveillance. Thought that was quite leading there because, of course, there's this notion that, you know, you're private, you know, any private entity doing digital identification. If you have a Google account, if you have a Facebook account, you know, this is not government surveillance. This is private sector surveillance, if you go, and international for that matter. So let's keep these things in proportion, I think. Do we have perhaps David? You've got your mic on there. Sounds like you're keen to answer this one.
I think this is a really important topic, and you know, Tom mentioned this earlier. You know, the right of revocation, the ability to revoke an authority that's been delegated to an agency, and at the moment we've inadvertently delegated our authority to, you know, so many third parties that they are legally entitled to, you know, protect us in their way, whether that's surveillance or whatever it may be. So the only solution really is for us to be able to have a dashboard and to be able to see where we've delegated our authority so that we can revoke it.
Thank you.
And I think people and delegate it, you know, where it's warranted. But I think, and people have recognized this issue and are working towards it, but it's a very big challenge.
Last comment from you, Tom.
Yeah, look, I was just gonna add really that the I don't know, chicken and egg sort of scenario where the regulation or the regulatory approach is always going to be slightly behind the technology's advancement and ability. So I wouldn't be looking for a technical solution to that sort of challenge, but from a regulatory one. So, you know, in terms, and surveillance is a loaded word, but the ability for organisations to share, for instance, or to match data up against other sets, is something that's obviously controlled at the moment through the Privacy Act. I think there are mechanisms to make sure that regulation could probably be more effectively applied, but I certainly wouldn't be expecting a technical solution at any point soon. Simply because of the volume of data out there that can be matched up, some of which is given freely online as well, don't forget.
And Sarah's queued up to come onto the back.
Thank you. I think it's also worth noting that the trust framework that the government have designed doesn't rely on government agencies being the authenticators or verifiers. So it sets up for third parties to establish themselves as those trusted verifiers. So individuals can make choices as to which third party they prefer. And of course, it doesn't mean that the government finds out why I need to verify or identify myself with my passport. It doesn't know who that's gone to. So I think there are some controls already built into the trust framework that are really worth exploring.
Yes.
That's what I wanted to add there.
That's great. So the next one's a technical question. And so I'm just going to throw it open to any panelists that wishes to tackle it. And this is from Stuart Campbell. Do you see any drive towards specific authentication using biometrics as a trusted mechanism of identity? We want to perhaps start. David's got his mic open there. That's whether that was intentional or not, David, but
biometrics as trusted. Well, the biology is the truly analog thing in the digital world. So a scenario within which there is an immutable way to prove that, absolutely. But then you have a dependency on that biology, which becomes very inconvenient. So I would say there are pros and cons to both, but yeah, it has merit as a concept.
Right.
Yeah.
Any thoughts from anyone else? I've got Rick's question and Paula's behind here.
Look, I just to sort of follow up on that, I think sort of going back to what I was saying before, the biometrics is going to carry on leaps and bounds, and at the moment, you know, we're all used to opening our phones with a thumb or our face. But at some point there'll be hacks, or there'll be so I think the more secure is always going to be multi-factor of different components, so that there's two pathways in, or there's two pieces of data that need to be reconciled. I don't see it ever being a single one.
Right. Yep.
And scale, of course. So I think scaling to be, you know, if it's really something that needs to be locked down, you obviously wrap more control around it.
Yeah. Paula Petley has given her own view there, really as part of, I think it is part of this question. That's her, this is her view on it. Interesting points there. Thank you for those, Paula. I would like to just turn to Rick Shearer's question here, panel. He's interested in ID versus identity differentiation. Does he mean identity versus identity differentiation? In particular, the attribution, analysis, and publication and potentially distortion or exaggeration of a person's beliefs as a means of outing them or attacking them. Is our Privacy Act sufficient here? Not sure that the Privacy Act's the right piece of legislation that is that question here. Well, Sarah's got her mic open, so she's keen on it. Let's go, Sarah.
I might be misunderstanding the question, but I've been thinking about this in the lead up to the session. So I think there's really the ability with digital identity to know that somebody is just a unique individual who acquires the services, as opposed to needing to know who they are. So sometimes for banking services and so on, for AML, we need to know who the customer is and what their verification background is and so on. But I think for a lot of services, we're identifying people, we really just want to know that they are a human and a unique human. We don't need to know their name or any other attributes about them. So I think if I'm interpreting the question rightly, I agree that there's a lot of ability just to be able to service people without collecting so much information about them. And I think it's Principle 1 of the Privacy Act makes it quite clear that we shouldn't be asking for identity information where we don't need it to provide services. So I might have it wrong, we're happy to catch up another time and talk it through. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, there are sort of, it's one of the interesting things, of course, you look at the UK with its Online Harms Act that's currently being discussed. It's trying to tackle this kind of issue, you know, sort of pretty much head on. Any other panelists? Karen's got her mic open.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Sarah was saying in terms of, you know, the purpose of collection, you know, why you're collecting the information. And so I guess I was just pondering this in terms of the way that Rick has sort of articulated the information might be used. So, you know, it would seem that, you know, if that wasn't the purpose for which the information was collected, I think there's, you know, a clear breach of the privacy principle.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't, the fact that there is a privacy principle that that prohibits this doesn't mean that it won't happen, but I guess there is a framework in the Act to deal with it. Right.
I mean, and in many respects, that's a perfect segue to our last question, to ask each of you what you think that people in services and service providers need. So both, you know, consumers of digital identity and service providers providing that need to think about when creating or using digital identities to address some of the challenges and risks that we've identified. I would ideally like to start with Karen because she brought this question to the panel initially. Do you want to sort of frame it up for us, Karen, and then we'll let the other panelists have a go?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking was just in terms of, you know, what people should be thinking about. And I guess I'm looking at it primarily from a Privacy Act perspective in terms of, you know, because that's my area of practice. And I guess I was thinking about the fact that, well, whilst we've got a Privacy Act, which is relatively new, when you look down to the basics of the Act, you know, at the core of it, we've got 13 information privacy principles, 12 of which are pretty much exactly the same as what they were in the 1993 Act. And so we're not really dealing with anything new. It's more in terms of what the law is. It's more about how the law is applied to the new technology, and obviously there are, you know, increasing challenges that arise from that. But I guess my thinking was that it just means that we need to be a little bit more nimble in our thinking and in terms of how we apply the principles. And I think that the challenge for people is that because the principles are principles, and I think they have to be principles because the Act has to be technology neutral,
Right.
because otherwise it's going to be out of date before it's even passed if it's not.
Yes, I mean, it took 3 years to get the last one.
No, longer than that.
Low, was it?
Yeah, because the Law Commission did a report back in 2011.
Oh gosh, right.
So it was, yeah, quite some time in the making. So I think, you know, just recognizing the fact that, you know, there isn't any bright line test in the Act in terms of whether you comply or not. It's really a question of, you know, what are reasonable steps, and whether or not you're acting in a reasonable manner. And that's always going to involve considering factors on a you know, case-by-case basis, and you know, our environment changes and people's thinking changes. So I think it's being mindful of that.
Right.
And I think the OPC has indicated that they are cognizant of this, and and are aware of the fact that people are looking for a bit more guidance in this area.
Right. Okay. We had another panelist. So Tom has opened his microphone. This is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for you to queue up. Thank you, Tom. Next.
Look, I was just reminded Karen sort of saying that the Act was being sort of well considered back in 10, 15 years ago, however long it was. I remember at a seminar, John Edwards is the prior Privacy Commissioner, sort of saying something along the lines that the 2020 Act is a well-conceived piece of legislation for 2012. It's just took so long to get over the line. But look, to answer the question, from my point of view, I think one of the things that's forgotten a lot about is that once somebody's identity has been verified, that's just the beginning of the obligation that the organisation has to manage the information that they've collected about that person. And I think that step is often the one that gets ignored at system design level or at sort of process or management level, which is how you end up with disastrous breaches down the line, because the data's come in, it's been verified, you've been checked, you've been given access to whatever it is that you need to have, and everything just accretes. So wearing a biased archives records management hat, I think you need to consider the management of privacy data in information management, or through an information management lens, and the two go really, really closely hand in hand.
Right.
And it's through that process and that sort of privacy by design, information management by design thinking that you do have the potential to reduce a lot of that post-usage risk. So that would be my 2 cents in that domain. Okay,
thank you for that. We're not going to get all through all these questions, I think, in the time available. But any thoughts from any of our panelists before we look at Dave Roberts's question? Is the future of digital ID centralized or decentralized? Before we go there, any other thoughts on what people or service providers need to think about to add to the panelists who've already done that? And Sarah has her mic open.
Yeah, I'd probably just add that really thinking about your end users and what their expectations are from you as an organisation. And a lot of the things we talked about are really about trust, and sort of almost doing a privacy impact assessment. And as Tom mentioned, using privacy by design to think about what is the purpose of verifying customers, what credentials do you actually need to verify and test using digital identity, and just keeping in mind how you're going to bring your customers on board so that they think it's a good thing for them as well.
Right, this transparency is key there. Looking at Dave's question, is the future of digital ID centralized or decentralized? Perfect one for you, David Ding. You already have your mic open.
Yeah, so what I would say is I think that the technology that will enable us to trust a centralized single source of truth, I think the technology will be decentralized. And I think that will be what enables us to trust that single source of truth, which to my mind will be moated like a black box. And we'll trust that whoever has access to that, that's a trusted person or third party to us. But I do actually think it's possible.
Right. Yep. Indeed. Thank you for that. Let's just move briefly on, see what we can achieve with Paul's question here. So he's brought up two links. How can the government be entrusted to ensure the security of such a digital identification system? He's brought up the ADAHA one, which of course is a central biometrics, effectively database, centralized one. And certainly there's no sort of kind of direct equivalent to ADAHA, but closest maybe RealMe. And certainly the other wide one, digital IDs are more dangerous than you think, is the other one that he's brought up there. Your middle point, of course, is that some of these are not government, right? I mean, the only, you could, in this widest context, you've got my IR, my MSD, RealMe, certainly immigration are holding information when you travel, and for travel and for work permits and so on. So you've got those sorts of things there, but is there, what's people's quick view of the government being entrusted to ensure security, particularly security? Of course, we've got the new act, the Digital Identity Trust Framework Act, which of course Digital Identity Services Trust Framework Act is trying to do that exactly. But any other thoughts from the panel? Just all comers, because we'll move on quickly. Not seeing any. Okay, Tom.
Look, how long's a piece of string would be?
Yes, quite.
I don't know that it's necessarily a government or private sector binary. I think it's what are the mechanisms that we need in place to create that trust. And I think trust has been the theme of this conversation this afternoon. So I don't know that it's necessarily how can we trust the government or how can we trust the private sector. It's what do we need to establish that trust in the first place, and then build from there, regardless of who's doing the building.
Yes. So Marianne Corkery has an interesting question here, partly answered, I think, with some of the answers you've given. Perhaps identification verifiers need to provide individuals control as the owner of the identification documents or proof. Would a system whereby you could at any time see who accessed your identification stuff, for what reason, help with public trust? Should this be a must-have? Now, it's something that Estonia has. So you can log in with your identity card into the Estonian system and see where, remember it's a centralized government run system there, see where the government has accessed your identity details and for what reason. But do we see that in a wider context, panel? Tom, you've got your
Yeah, look, I think that's awesome, and it goes to the notion of control that I was talking about earlier. I'd love to see something here, not just that who had looked at it, but what it had been used for and all the rest of it. So it gives you the control back, and ideally that you could revoke it as well if you've got to the point where you've ended your relationship with that provider.
Absolutely. Okay, any other panelists? Panelists, do you have some other thoughts there? And of course, Anna has added this be useful given the government data sharing that occurs. So to your point, Tom. Panelists, do you have another view there on Marianne's question? Should it be a must-have to have that transparency? Karen's got her mic open.
I was just going to say that Tom picked up on a point that isn't in Marianne's question, but the fact that authorization to access should be given. So the person should be controlling who has access in the first place, not only who has looked at it.
Yeah, the basics of consent and so on, and authorization. You're right. Okay, so with that, we've got very little time, or we've got Tully Gray's question here. With the introduction to AI, information security and privacy with the introduction of AI, I think it is, information security and privacy is being blended. Yeah, our digital identity is almost schizophrenic in nature, as I can now embody or represent anyone, and it needs to start at the initial interface, the hardware AGI level, to form controls of what AI can access in real time. Look, not putting you on the spot, David, but Callaghan Innovation and your personal experience and personal passions has to be you to start, I think.
Yeah, totally valid. I think, most of the models that we're seeing now are just massive data lakes, and everyone's using chatbots is training the model. But I think what we're seeing is evolutions of models such as constitutional AI, whereby the interpretation layer can be held within like a constitution, and the sovereignty and the stewardship of that can be with the user, either using a cold wallet system, if it's on your phone. But this is where the trend is going. It's similar to blockchain, where the fragmentation of a database is what imbues trust into it. I think the fragmentation of the data lake is what we're seeing with constitutional AI. So that's that's the trend I'm seeing now.
Yep, absolutely. And with that, we're right on time, people. I just want to thank the audience so much for their interesting questions. What a range, and it's great that we've held so much of the audience for so long. So that's terrific. Thank you, Nori, for that thought. Great session. I totally agree. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Sarah, Karen, David, and Tom, for providing us a stunning feedback session. I hope both the audience and the panelists have enjoyed it as much as I have. Haere rā. Have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Many thanks all. Cheers.
Thank you.